The year was 55 BC. The wind off the Atlantic was sharp and insistent, tugging at the canvas sails of the Roman triremes as they crept along the unknown edge of the world. Julius Caesar stood aboard his flagship, watching the low gray cliffs of Britannia rise like a ghost from the sea mist. This wasn't conquest, not yet. It was spectacle, a carefully orchestrated show of strength. And it was personal. Caesar, at that moment, was more than a general. He was a man chasing reputation. Back in Rome, politics seethed with rivalries and ambition. Victory in Gaul had won him admiration. But Britannia, untouched, mysterious, was something else. It offered a legend. What he found was not a land eager to be conquered, but a shoreline bristling with resistance. The Roman fleet landed near modern-day Kent, greeted not by tribute-bearers, but by war cries. The Britons, painted and agile, surged from the forest edges. They knew the terrain intimately, the mud flats, the tides, the sharp marsh reeds, and they wielded it like a weapon. Their chariots skittered across the fields, their horses light and fast, their javelins precise. To the Roman infantry, this was not a battlefield, but a quagmire. Caesar's men struggled in the surf, shields up, boots sinking into the wet sand. Javelins rained down from the cliffs. Spears clattered off helmets. It was not the clean maneuver of textbook warfare. It was messy, improvised, real. The Romans managed to push inland, but achieved little. The Britons fought in a different rhythm, dispersing, reappearing, attacking from shadow. When Caesar realized the weather and tides were turning against him, he pulled back. One campaign, one report to send home, but he wasn't finished. The following year, 54 BC, he returned with more ships, more men, and a sharper plan. This time the landing was smoother. The Britons, perhaps intimidated by the size of the force, avoided a direct confrontation. Caesar pressed further inland, seeking alliances, securing hostages, demonstrating Roman might through negotiation as much as force. He engaged the powerful tribal leader, Cassivellaunus, whose guerrilla tactics again slowed the advance, but failed to drive Rome back. Still, Caesar never built forts. He never planted the eagle standards to mark permanent ground. By autumn, with storms threatening his supply lines, he withdrew again. This time, leaving a more lasting impression, an image of Britannia as a borderland of myth and danger, a land of fog honor and untamed tribes. He returned to Gaul with no territory, but with stories. And those stories were gold in Rome. They filled the scrolls of the Commentari de Bello Gallico, Caesar's own account of his campaigns, written in crisp, detached prose that blurred the line between military report and political autobiography. There's a theatrical quality to how Caesar frames Britannia. He describes the tides with awe, the sun's path as foreign, the people as fierce but naive. He knew his audience. He crafted not just a record, but a myth. One where he, standing in the cold waters of a northern sea, had looked into the eyes of the unknown and returned triumphant. Even in failure, he won. Because what Caesar really brought back from Britannia wasn't conquest, it was narrative. He transformed the island into an exotic mirror for Roman virtue, Rome as the center of order, Britannia as the edge of chaos. That contrast fed the imperial imagination for generations, and so, though no roads were laid, no garrisons built, and no temples raised to Roman gods in those first expeditions, a seed was planted, a curiosity, a claim. When Claudius returned nearly a century later with elephants and legions and a full plan for occupation, it was Caesar's footsteps they followed. Not across stone roads, but through memory, the kind of memory crafted by ambition, sharpened by rhetoric, and sealed into the story Rome told about itself And Britannia, it waited, misty, defiant, and patient. Almost a century passed before Rome returned, not with a scout's curiosity this time, but with imperial resolve. It was the year 43 AD, and the emperor, Claudius, often mocked in Rome for his stammer and limp, saw in Britannia a stage upon which he could prove his strength. What better way to silence senators than to lead the conquest of a land even Julius Caesar couldn't tame? So, he sent 4 legions over 40,000 soldiers across the sea. Among them were engineers, surveyors, and even elephant symbols, not just of Rome's might, but its spectacle. This wasn't just military domination. It was a performance of empire. The invasion was swift and calculated. The Romans landed again in Cantois, met resistance, but this time it was overcome by numbers, discipline, and overwhelming strategy. The native tribes were fragmented, and while some fought, others quickly submitted. Within months, Rome had secured a foothold, and within a few years, the south of Britain began to look and feel Roman. Towns sprang up like seeds after rain. Londinium. Today's London was carved from marsh and clay, soon bridged across the Thames. Camulodunum became the first capital its name, a Latin echo of a Celtic stronghold. Roads were cut straight through forest and hill, threading the land into Rome's vast network. Public baths shimmered with warm water. Forums echoed with Latin commerce. Verulamium. Aquae Sulis. Eboracum. Names that would one day weather into ghosts began their lives in marble and stone. The Roman model was precise build infrastructure, established civic centers, and offered just enough of Rome to entice the elite. For native chiefs who cooperated, there were gifts. Roman citizenship villas with underfloor heating, silk wine mosaics. Their sons were educated in Roman schools, their daughters adorned in Roman jewelry. Assimilation came not by force alone, but by allure. But this vision of civilization wasn't universal. For many native Britons, especially those in the Pau, north and west or Rome, wasn't a promise. It was an occupation. A system of taxes, military checkpoints, and foreign gods. The further one traveled from the urbanized south, the less Rome looked like prosperity and more like a long shadow creeping over the land. Resistance simmered. It boiled over most famously in 60 or 61 AD, when the Romans made a fatal mistake. Upon the death of King Prasutagus, ruler of the Iceni tribe and nominal Roman ally, the empire moved to seize his lands. His widow, Boudicca, was flogged. Her daughters were raped. The message was clear. Alliance meant submission, but Rome had underestimated her. Boudicca, with fiery hair and a voice that could carry across fields, united several tribes and unleashed a storm. Her armies sacked Camulodunum, then Londinium, then Verulamium. 3 Roman towns razed to ash. Tens of thousands were killed. Roman citizens impaled, burned, or flung into sacred marshes. For a moment, the conquest teetered, but Rome does not yield easily. The governor, Suetonius Paulinus, returning from campaigns in Wales, regrouped his forces and met Boudicca's army on open ground. The Romans, though outnumbered, fought in tight formation, their discipline slicing through the larger but less coordinated native host. Boudicca was defeated by sword, by strategy, by cold iron. Her fate is uncertain. Some say she drank poison, others that she vanished into the forest, swallowed by myth. After the revolt, Rome tightened its grip. No more leniency. Forts expanded. Garrison towns multiplied. Roman law came down harder. Britannia, once an edge-of-the-map mystery, was now a province under watch, and still the frontier pushed outward, under emperors like Vespasian, Then, Hadrian. The legions moved northward, pressing into modern-day Scotland, where the land turned wild and the tribes turned ghostly. Here, conquest faltered, and here Rome built a wall, not just of stone, but of intent. The Boime Wall of Hadrian, stretching 73 miles. From coast to coast wasn't simply a barrier. It was a statement. The end of the world. A line drawn between Roman order and barbarian chaos. It had gates and watchtowers, barracks and mile castles. To cross it was to step out of empire and into something ancient and unknowable. But even Hadrian's wall didn't hold forever. A second wall. Antonines was built further north but abandoned within decades. Rome had reached the limits not just of geography, but of will warn. The frontier was now a tide surging and receding, and yet for over 3 centuries, Rome stayed. They built, they taxed, they ruled. They married locals, worshipped old gods with new names, and spoke a Latin tinged with the cadence of wet hills and northern stars. Children were born who had never seen Rome, but wore its seal. Farmers grew olives in pots under English clouds. Soldiers raised togas at temples of Mithras and Mars. Britannia became not just a conquest, but were a limb of Rome itself. Until one day the limb would be cut off, but that, as all things in empire, would come slowly and then all at once. It began, as many Roman tragedies do, with the illusion of partnership. When the king of the Iceni, a client tribe in eastern Britannia, passed away around 60 AD, he left behind what he hoped would be a diplomatic solution, a will naming both his daughters and the Roman emperor as co-heirs to his kingdom. It was a gesture of trust, a political tightrope walk meant to keep his people safe. Rome, of course, had no intention of sharing. The imperial officials moved quickly. They seized lands. They confiscated property from the Iceni nobility. And when Queen Boudicca, the king's widow, protested, they responded with cruelty. She was publicly flogged. Her daughters were raped. The message was unambiguous. Rome was not a partner. Rome was a master, but Boudicca did not submit. Instead, she rose. Descriptions of her survive in the writings of Tacitus and Dio Cassius. They paint a picture of a woman with flaming red hair flowing to her waist, eyes sharp with rage, voice like thunder. Whether those details are fact or myth hardly matters now. What matters is what she did. She rallied the Iceni. Then she rallied others, the Trinovantes, the Catuvalauni tribes who had tasted the bitter edge of Roman betrayal. Together, they became a storm. Boudicca's rebellion was not just a military act, it was a spiritual uprising, a reassertion of identity against erasure. The Druids whispered ancient chants. Warriors painted their bodies with blue woad, and behind their chariots roared the sound of vengeance. Their first target was Camulodunum, modern-day Colchester, the Roman colonial capital. Once a glittering showpiece of empire, it fell within days. The garrison was overwhelmed. Roman settlers were slaughtered. The temple of Claudius, towering in imperial pride, became a tomb. Next came Londinium. Governor Suetonius Paulinus, then campaigning in Wales, hurried back. He assessed the situation and made a brutal choice. Londinium, still young and poorly defended, was abandoned. Its citizens, many of them Romanized Britons, were left to their fate. Boudicca's forces burned the town to ash. Verulamium followed. Archaeological layers still reveal charred debris, carbonized grain, blackened soil. By some estimates, up to 70,000 Roman citizens and allies were killed. But the revolt, for all its fury, lacked Rome's discipline. When Boudicca's army finally met Paulinus in open battle, likely along Watling Street, though the exact location is lost, the advantage shifted. The Romans, fewer in number, held formation. They let the Britons charge, absorbed the shock, then counterattacked with terrifying efficiency. Trapped by their own wagons in the rear, Boudicca's forces couldn't retreat. The battlefield became a slaughter. Boudicca herself disappears from the record here. Some say she took poison rather than face capture. Others claim she fled and died quietly. What remains is not her grave, but her legend, a figure both feared and revered, still honored today as a symbol of resistance. But Rome learned its lesson. After the revolt, the imperial hand grew heavier. More forts were built. Garrison towns expanded. The army reorganized and hardened. No longer was Britannia a frontier of soft assimilation. It became a land of watchtowers and patrols of oaths taken at sword point. And yet even this would not be enough. Over the next decades, as Rome pushed north into what is now Scotland, they encountered not large cities or standing armies, but something more elusive. The Picts, tribal confederations who moved like shadows through forests and highland mist. They fought in ambush, struck at night, vanished by dawn. They didn't seek victory, they sought erosion, to wear down the Romans year by year. To counter this, Rome turned to stone. Under the rule of Emperor Hadrian, a new vision took shape. If the empire could not pacify the north, it would contain it. And so began the construction of one of Rome's greatest feats of engineering, Hadrian's Wall. Stretching some 73 miles from the River Tyne in the east to the Solway Firth in the west, the wall wasn't just a barrier, it was a philosophical statement. A declaration that here in the damp and rolling green of northern Britannia, civilization stopped. Beyond it lay wilderness, the untamed, the unknowable. The wall stood around 15 feet high, built from stone and turf, and dotted with mile castles, watchtowers, and forts. Soldiers stationed here lived in harsh conditions, battered by wind and rain, far from Rome's marble streets. But they held the line, and yet the wall was porous. Trade still flowed, ideas still passed, and even some locals, rather than resist, adapted. They lived near the wall, worked with its garrisons, sold goods to its markets. Some even joined the auxiliary troops. The frontier in practice was less a severed edge and more a membrane filtering empire in and out. Hadrian's Wall, then, was not a monument to total control, but to pragmatism, a way of marking Rome's limits without surrendering its presence. It allowed the empire to breathe, to settle, but it was also a quiet admission, an admission that Rome could not have everything, that even its might had boundaries, and that in places like Britannia, sometimes the best one could hope for was a line in the earth and the promise to hold it. The 3rd century after Christ dawned not with peace, but with the distant rumble of unraveling. Across the vast sweep of the Roman Empire from the Rhine to the Euphrates, cracks had begun to spread hairline fractures in the marble facade of a world that once seemed eternal. Emperors came and went in flurries, many lasting no longer than a season. Civil wars erupted like brush fires, borders blurred. And within this storm, Britannia, long the cold windswept outpost on the edge of the known world, found itself both more vital and more vulnerable than ever before. The crisis of the 3rd century is often remembered as a time when Rome nearly fell apart. But in Britannia, it was the time when Rome began to let go. It started with a general. Claudius Albinus, governor of Britannia in the late 190s, was a man of ambition. When the Emperor Pertinax was murdered and the throne went up for sale to the highest bidder, a grim moment even by Roman standards, Albinus saw an opening. At first, he allied with Septimius Severus, another contender for the imperial purple. But alliances in this era were more smoke than stone. When the dust settled, Severus turned on Albinus. In 197 AD, The two armies met in the Battle of Lugdunum deep in Gaul, one of the largest battles ever fought between Roman forces. Albinus, having withdrawn a massive portion of Britannia's garrison to support his claim, lost decisively. His troops were butchered. He was either killed in battle or took his own life. His head was sent to Severus as a warning, but the warning wasn't just for pretenders. It was a warning for Britannia itself. With its legions gutted, its leadership shattered, and its defenses exposed, the province teetered. It would not be the last time this would happen. In the decades that followed, Britannia became the stage for a repeating tragedy. Each time the empire convulsed, each time generals fought over thrones, or emperors demanded loyalty from afar, troops would be pulled from the island, leaving towns, farms, and trade routes defenseless. And each time the consequences were more severe. In 260 AD, the empire broke apart into three pieces: the Central Roman state in Italy, the breakaway Palmyrene Empire in the east, and in the west, the so-called Gallic Empire, a separatist Roman regime that included Gaul, parts of Spain, and crucially Britannia. Its leader, Postumus, was another military man who seized the moment. He styled himself Emperor. Minted coins ruled from Trier, and for nearly a decade maintained a semblance of order. To many in Britannia, Rome had not fallen, it had simply relocated. But the Gallic Empire was not built to last. It lacked the infrastructure, the resources, and perhaps most importantly, the myth of Rome. When Postumus was assassinated by his own troops, the empire began to disintegrate. Britannia was pulled back into the orbit of central Rome, but the gravitational pull had weakened. Then came Carausius, a commander of the Roman fleet in the Channel. Carausius had been tasked with hunting pirates, but rumors spread he was keeping some of the loot for himself. Ordered to face charges, he did what so many men in that century did. He declared himself emperor, but unlike others, he succeeded. From 286 to 293 AD, Carausius ruled Britannia as an independent Roman state. He struck coins bearing his name alongside that of Rome, boasting of a restoration of liberty. He repaired roads, fortified coastal defenses, and even claimed divine favor. Some of his coinage carries slogans like "Spirit of Britain," suggesting a deepening identification with the land he ruled, not just as a Roman, but as something uniquely Britannic. To the people of Britannia especially, the elites in Romanized towns like Londinium Verulamium and Eboracum Carausius may have offered stability where Rome could not. He brought troops home. He stood guard against Saxon raids. He gave the appearance of continuity, but his reign too came undone. He was assassinated by his own finance minister Electus, who ruled for a few more years before being defeated by the Roman general Constantius Chlorus, father of Constantine the Great. The Roman legions returned, landing on the southern coast and reportedly burning ships to prevent retreat. The city of Londinium was retaken. Electus was killed in battle or captured and executed. Rome had reclaimed its island, but it had paid a price. Each of these rebellions, from Albinus to Carausius, highlighted a painful paradox. The more Rome relied on Britannia for military support, the more it abandoned the province to chaos. Troops withdrawn for imperial ambition left towns exposed. Trade with Gaul, once the lifeline of the province, faltered under separatism and war. The economy sagged. Defensive infrastructure deteriorated. This pattern became known to historians as the British mistake. It was a cycle of extraction without renewal. And by the late 3rd century, the people of Britannia began to feel it. Roman authority no longer meant security, it meant instability. The cities still stood with their bathhouses and basilicas. The coins still bore the image of distant emperors. But something had changed in the air. A tension, a weariness, and then quietly something else began. In the rural highlands of the north, in the valleys of Wales, and the deep woods of the west, local power structures began to grow. Fortified farmsteads, hilltop villages, leaders who spoke Latin but also Britannic, who wore Roman rings but kept Celtic gods. Rome still claimed ownership, but ownership is not the same as control. By the turn of the 4th century, Britannia was increasingly self-reliant, not because it chose to be, but because it had to be. With every rebellion, every withdrawal, every delayed shipment of silver or soldiers, the people learned to look inward, to patch their own roads, to defend their own coasts, to imagine a world where Rome was not the beginning and end of all things. And so before the legions ever left for good, Rome had already begun to fade. The empire's structures remained the amphitheaters, the villas, the aqueducts, but they were now skins without muscle words, without breath. Rome had built cities in stone, but forgotten to leave behind roots. And when the storms came, raiders from the sea warlords, from the hills, hunger from the earthstone alone would not hold. What was once a proud province had become a threshold neither Roman nor fully independent, a liminal space, a place between worlds. It would not stay that way for long. It happened in the dead of winter. The year was 367 AD, and Britannia slept beneath a veil of frost. The fields were quiet, the roads empty. The garrisons along the frontier were thin, scattered, some abandoned. A sense of uneasy calm had settled over the island, but it was the calm of still water before a storm. And then all at once the storm came. What unfolded would later be called the Barbarian conspiracy, a phrase heavy with fear and confusion. To the Roman mind, it was almost unthinkable that multiple groups unrelated, divided by sea and mountain, could somehow attack at once in a single coordinated strike. The truth may have been messier, but the result was the same. The northern tribes, the Picts, fierce and elusive, crossed Hadrian's wall, in waves slipping through gaps in the fortifications that Rome no longer had the manpower to guard. From the west, the Scotty warriors from what is now Ireland launched raids across the sea, pillaging coastal settlements and vanishing before counterattack. And from the east, the Saxons, sharp-sailed and opportunistic, struck along the southern shores. 3 fronts, 1 island, no warning. For months chaos reigned, villages burned, roads became ambush zones, Roman estates, once symbols of order and civilization, were ransacked or abandoned. Even London, once a jewel of the province, was left vulnerable. Officials were killed. Some forts surrendered without a fight. Others were overrun, their walls breached not by siege engines, but by hunger, betrayal, or sheer exhaustion. Among the worst blows came from within. One of the empire's most trusted commanders in Britannia, Philophaudes, was captured, perhaps even killed under murky circumstances. At the same time, the Comes Maritimus, the officer responsible for coastal defense, mysteriously vanished. Leadership crumbled. Communications with the continent were cut. Britannia for a time was on its own. The empire's response was slow but not silent. Word eventually reached Valentinian for the emperor stationed in Trier, deep in Gaul. He was a hardened military man, and the news from Britannia reportedly left him in a rage. The entire fabric of Roman order on the island had been torn. It was not just a military failure, it was an insult. He chose a commander with a reputation for ruthlessness, Count Theodosius, a general with both cunning and cold resolve. He arrived in 368 AD, bringing with him fresh troop supplies and a plan. It was not enough to reclaim lost ground. Theodosius intended to reassert Roman authority from the bones upward. His campaign was swift, surgical. He retook key towns. He rebuilt garrisons. He reorganized the shattered provincial government. He recruited local militias, hunted down collaborators, and dealt harshly with deserters. To the terrified Roman citizens, still clinging to ruined farms and villas, Theodosius was both sword and savior. To the invaders, he was shadow and fire. Within a year, Roman control was re-established on the surface, but beneath something had changed. The conspiracy of 367 wasn't just a military failure. It was a moment of psychological rupture, a revelation. For centuries, Roman Britannia had existed under the illusion of stability of walls and legions and imperial invincibility. But now even the illusion was cracked. The conspiracy revealed how thin the line had become, how vulnerable the cities were, how stretched the legions had grown, how quickly the distant light of Rome could flicker when the island was left to its own devices. Theodosius returned to the continent in 369, having done his duty. The roads were reopened, the forts restaffed, the coins struck anew with imperial faces. But the people remembered the winter, the fires, the silence after the screams, and those memories lingered. From that point on, Roman Britain never truly recovered its confidence. There were no more grand construction projects, no new cities, no new roads. The structures of empire remained, but they felt more like relics than institutions, and outside the walls the tribes watched. The Picts, the Saxons, the Scotti. They had tasted the fragility of Roman power. They had seen the cracks beneath the marble, and they knew the next time they came, they wouldn't leave. It began not with a trumpet, but with a letter. In the year 410 AD, as the empire trembled under pressure from all sides, a delegation of Romanized Britons reached out to the emperor Honorius, pleading for help. Barbarian threats loomed. Cities lay exposed. The once mighty garrisons had thinned to shadows. They begged Rome to send reinforcements, to restore order, to remember them. But Rome had no memory left to spare. Honorius replied with words that would echo through the ages. "You must look to your own defenses." That was it. No promise of return, no timeline, no strategy, just a polite abdication. For nearly 4 centuries, Rome had claimed Britannia, fortified it, taxed it, reshaped its landscape and identities. And now, like a spent coin, it was dropped. The legions did not march out in formation. There was no formal ceremony. It was a slow evaporation, a garrison recalled here, a supply line cut there. Soldiers once stationed at Hadrian's wall were redeployed to Italy or simply faded into the local population, taking Roman names, wives' customs, but no longer orders. In towns like Londinium, the effects were almost immediate. Trade stalled. Coinage became scarce. Markets shrank. Public buildings fell into disrepair. Some were cannibalized columns and bricks repurposed to patch crumbling homes. The great bathhouses went cold, their pools dry, their mosaics chipped by weather and time. The elite who had once dined on imported wine and debated Roman law began to retreat. Many fled inland to fortified villas or walled hill forts echoing a landscape from centuries before. The rural poor, long marginalized under Roman bureaucracy, found themselves suddenly cut loose without tax collectors. Yes, but also without protection. The cities didn't vanish overnight, but their meaning did. Rome had not just been stone and infrastructure. It had been belief in order and hierarchy, in the continuity of civilization. Without that belief, the stones became weight, the walls burdens, the forums silent theaters of a play that no longer had an audience. And yet people adapted. In the absence of central power, local leaders emerged, some former Roman officials, others tribal chieftains who had waited patiently beneath the surface of imperial rule. They filled the vacuum with their own laws, their own militias, their own gods. Christianity, once a fringe cult in the province, grew bolder. Bishops took on civil roles. Churches became town centers. The land itself began to shift. Farmlands that had been worked in Roman grid patterns fell into irregular local use. Long-distance trade collapsed. Pottery, once mass-produced in kilns from Gaul or Italy, was now handmade, crude, domestic. Literacy declined. Writing, once the vehicle of empire, became the domain of priests and monks. But what may be most striking is what did not happen. There was no great invasion immediately after Rome left. No single barbarian army sweeping the countryside. Instead, Britannia entered a twilight phase, not yet medieval, no longer classical. A place where Roman villas coexisted with thatched huts, where broken aqueducts stood like ribs in the hills, and where people walked on roads laid by engineers they no longer remembered. For a generation or two, children grew up speaking a hybrid tongue Latin laced with Celtic rhythms. They played among ruins, not fully understanding what those structures had once meant. They plowed fields beside fallen milestones. They lived in a world that felt ancient and immediate all at once. Some historians have called this period a ghost province, a land abandoned by empire, but still haunted by its presence. The rituals of Roman governance lingered in form, if not function. Coins with long-dead emperors were still used. Some settlements still held councils in emptied basilicas, their voices echoing against cracked marble walls. But as decades passed, the ghost faded. By the mid-5th century, raiders from across the sea angles, Saxons, Jutes, began to arrive in earnest. Some came as mercenaries hired by desperate local rulers to fend off enemies. Others came as settlers seizing land as their own. And with them came new languages, new beliefs, new violence. The Roman dream in Britannia, once so proudly etched in stone and law, was now a memory carried in fragments whispered by monks buried beneath the roots of ivy-covered ruins. And yet even in its end it had left a mark. Roman Britain had been an experiment to bring the machinery of empire to the edge of the world, to pave roads across misty moors, to raise temples beneath foreign stars. It had succeeded, and then it had failed. Not in fire, but in forgetting. Today, we walk through those remnants. The broken walls, the worn coins, the scattered inscriptions, and wonder. Not just what was lost, but how easily something so vast, so structured can slip away. Not with a battle, but with a sentence. You must look to your own defenses, and so they did. In the decades after Rome's quiet departure, Britannia did not erupt in chaos, but in silence. The kind of silence that hangs heavy in the air after a bell stops ringing. A silence that isn't peace, but absence. The empire had not simply left it, had evaporated like morning fog rising from the fields. And what it left behind was a world adrift, suspended between memory and survival. At first glance, life in the post-Roman province might have looked familiar. The road still ran straight across the hills, stones still firm underfoot. Towns still stood, Londinium, Verulamium, Corinium, though quieter now. The great Roman villas, once symbols of wealth and order, remained on the landscape like the bones of giants. But listen closely, and the stillness was deafening. The state had vanished. There were no more governors from Rome, no imperial decrees, no taxes paid in denarii. The Roman market economy, which had once buzzed with imported wine olive oil and North African pottery, ground to a halt. Shops shuttered, coinage dried up, and with the loss of money came the slow unraveling of everything it once powered. People began to abandon the towns. In Londinium, the forum weeds grew tall. The basilica, once echoing with legal argument and civic pride, became shelter for birds and wind. Archaeologists would one day find evidence of livestock tethered inside temples, grain stored in amphitheaters. Urban life, once the beating heart of Roman identity, had become impractical. Instead, people retreated to the countryside, to villages, hill forts, and fortified farmsteads. They clustered around strongholds, old tribal lands, or whatever passed for stability. Villas that survived the initial collapse were often divided, repurposed into makeshift homesteads, barns, or even cemeteries. Tombstones from Roman cemeteries were reused as building material. Latin inscriptions turned inward, buried in walls, their meanings forgotten. And with the retreat of structure came the retreat of knowledge. Writing, the very signature of Roman administration, became rare. The ability to read and compose in Latin faded. Pottery became simpler, handmade and unpainted. Kilns that once turned out thousands of identical bowls and jars fell silent. Tools once cast in uniform iron became local, improvised, sometimes crude. The concept of standardized measurement unraveled. Barter replaced currency. Contracts were no longer written, they were spoken or sworn. This is what historians call the end of complexity, not a descent into barbarism, but a shedding of systems, a return to essentials. In the face of insecurity, raids, famine, isolation, people streamlined. They focused on the soil beneath their feet, the family within their walls, the weapons within arm's reach. And yet it would be a mistake to call this period a total collapse. Culture survived, but it transformed. Christianity, introduced under Roman rule, evolved in the shadows. Isolated bishoprics clung to ritual and scripture, copying gospels by candlelight. In some places, churches remained intact stone testaments to faith in a world where governments had failed. Languages, too, morphed. Latin gave way to early Brittonic dialects, sprinkled with Germanic words from Saxon migrants. Names changed. Saints replaced emperors. Oral tradition rose again, and with it a different kind of history, one passed in story, not in stone. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of this era is what we don't find. The archaeological record goes quiet. Few written records, sparse artifacts, thin traces of trade. For a time, roughly a century, it is as if the land held its breath. Historians call this the silent century in Britannia's timeline. Not because nothing happened, but because so little remains to tell us how people endured it. We know they did. We find their footprints in the floors of reoccupied villas, their burial sites beside crumbling walls, their tools made from broken Roman blades, reforged into something new. They didn't live among ruins, they lived within them. They cooked where Romans once bathed. They prayed where emperors were once praised. They stitched the remnants of a grand civilization into the fabric of survival. And as they did, they began to forget. Not all at once, not everywhere. But gradually, generation by generation, the stories blurred. Children born in 420 AD might have heard of Rome from their grandparents. Children born in 450 perhaps only knew of a time when things were better. By 470, even that memory had grown pale, and so the silence deepened, not just in the land, but in the mind. When monks, centuries later, looked back on this period, they described it with dread, as the dark before the light. But to those who lived it, it was not darkness, it was necessity. They did what people always do when systems fail. They adapted. They rebuilt smaller, simpler, but not without hope. And in that quiet, seeds were sown, seeds that would one day bloom into new kingdoms, new legends, new histories. But for now, Britannia stood still, not dead, just forgotten. They called it The Ruin, a poem written in Old English sometime in the early medieval period, long after the legions had vanished and the cities had crumbled. Its author is unknown, its lines fractured like the walls it mourns. And yet, in its broken stanzas, there echoes a voice, haunted, reverent, and aching with wonder. The poem does not name the place it describes. It simply paints an image. Towering halls, now roofless hot baths, turned to moss columns, shattered, and streets once loud with joy, now stalked by wind. It speaks of splendor turned to stillness, of giants who built mighty works now reduced to dust and memory. It is one of the earliest reflections on ruin in the English language, and it likely describes a Roman town, perhaps Bath, perhaps Wroxeter, perhaps even London. But more than a place, it captures a feeling that of standing amid greatness that no longer understands your name. Imagine being that poet, walking through silent stone streets, seeing the shells of buildings raised by hands centuries before your birth. You don't know the language carved into the lintels. You don't know the gods once praised in these temples. You don't even know the names of the emperors whose statues lie beheaded in weeds. All you know is that someone once lived large here, and now, nothing. The poet writes, "The work of giants crumbled," and in that line is an entire history. Roman Britain, its roads, its laws, its mosaics and milestones, reduced not by invasion alone, but by time, neglect, and forgetting. No final battle, no glorious collapse, just a long, slow erosion. By the time of the ruins' writing, the people of Britannia had long ceased to think of themselves as Roman. They had new kings, new gods, new fears. The old cities were not revered, they were quarried. Their stones stolen to build new churches, farmhouses, and walls. The past wasn't sacred. It was useful, and yet not entirely lost. Because even in that anonymous poem, scratched onto a manuscript passed from scribe to scribe, there is awe, there is curiosity, there is the whisper of a question. Who were they, these giants? What did they dream? And how could it all fall apart? It is the same question we ask today, standing amid the ruins of Silchester, or pacing the baths at Aquae Sulis, or running our hands along the worn stones of Hadrian's wall. We wonder not just at what was built, but at how easily it slipped away. Because Rome in Britannia was not inevitable. It was not eternal. It was a system, a brilliant complex, and fragile one that depended on movement, memory, and belief. Once those began to falter, so too did the stones. And so in the end, the legacy of Roman Britain is not just in what remains, but in what doesn't. It lives in the empty spaces, in the questions without answers, in the quiet between stones. It lives in the English countryside where sheep graze beneath collapsed amphitheaters, in school children tracing Latin letters on broken tile, in the poet who more than 1,000 years ago stood among ruins and heard not silence, but the echo of something vast. The work of giants did crumble, but in crumbling it left behind wonder, and in wonder perhaps a kind of immortality.